Welcome everyone to episode 6 of the navigation series, where we're going to be focusing on setting up basic UI widget components and UI materials. If you want to skip the build process, I've packaged this as a standalone template that you can purchase on Fab, link in the description. Otherwise, grab your coffee and let's jump into it. Alright, to begin working on the third person to first person transition, we're going to first need to create a little bit of a user interface. And this will be how we actually trigger our transition from third person to first person and vice versa. Now, an easy way for us to get UI out of the box is to use the UI Material Lab. Now, if you don't see it readily available, you can head over to your Fab page, either in the Epic Games Launcher or online, search up UI Material Lab, and add it to your library. Once it's added to your library, you simply need to create a project and select the engine version that you would like to support. Now for me, I already have it created, so what I can do is just double click to open it up. All right, with the project open, we can press play. And you can see here, we have a bunch of menus, each with their own set of containers that are describing different animations that are possible. So we have a bunch over here that you can scroll through, and you can pick different effects, copy and paste them into your project if you'd like. Or if you want an actual pre-made one, you can head over to the end for applications. And in applications, essentially what they've done is they've combined a bunch of the different effects from our earlier menus and created usable widgets that you can easily grab. So for example, this little menu one looks like something that we can work with, and we can create a subtle sort of highlight effect that we'll use in our project. So to actually find it, you can go over to Widgets, WBP Material Lab main, and head over to the Material Lab applications. So these are the different pages held in a widget switcher. And we can see here that it's in our top right. So to actually access it, we'll edit Material Lab applications, which will open up the widget that has all of our created menu items. And then we can click this one widget in particular, open it up, and click the actual button background, since that's where this widget is. And we can see that our material is right here. So all we simply need to do is right click, Asset Actions, Migrate. And what that'll automatically do is grab all of the different material functions that are used to make this animation sequence, and it'll copy it over into our project. So I'll press OK, navigate to my project folder, and then make sure that I've selected the content and select folder. And now those items have been migrated. And I'll copy over one more material from the UI Material Lab, and that'll be these rounded corner ones. So finding that material, I'm going to migrate that as well. Now I can close this. And heading back into my project, we'll see that there's a new folder called UI Material Lab. So I can easily open that up and see that I now have our button available for us. So let's add some UI to our scene. The first thing that we'll want to do is create a new folder called User Interface. And then in this folder, we'll right click, go over to Blueprint, Blueprint class, and search up HUD. And we can just call this HUD underscore default. Now in our world settings, we'll drag and drop our HUD under the HUD class so that it's now set to be the default of our project. And beside the HUD, we'll right click again, create a user interface and a widget blueprint. And we can just create a basic widget blueprint. And I'm going to call this WBP for widget blueprint underscore toolbar. Now in here, we'll just grab a canvas panel for now. With my HUD default selected and applied to my world settings, if I press play, we can see that our button is not appearing at the top left. What we need to do now is open up our HUD default, go over to Event Graph, and at Event Begin Play, create widget of class, and under class, we'll go WBP toolbar, add to viewport. Compile, save. Now if I press play, we can see that we now have a button appearing at the top left of our screen. Now returning to where we were, we now have a button at the top left of our screen. And what I want to do is I want to create our buttons to be sort of in the middle right here. And I want a home button to trigger third person view, and I want a person walking to trigger first person view. So the first thing I'll do is I'll actually grab those assets. So I have these textures made. These are hand-drawn textures from one of my old projects. And what I'll do is I'll create a new folder in our user interface menu, and I'm going to call this textures, since I want to keep my UI textures separate from our material textures for the scene. And then I can just drag this out. Now, heading back to our toolbar widget, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this button for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's called a widget component, a reusable button basically that we can add a bunch of parameters to, so we can replicate it multiple times within our project without having to redo everything from scratch. So we'll go back over to user interface, widget blueprint, and we'll call this one WC for widget component underscore button. Opening up our button, I'm going to create an overlay and then a size box. And we're going to set the size box to something to a width and height override of 60 by 60. And then within our size box, we can add another overlay. And then we'll add an image. Set our horizontal and vertical alignment to fill the entirety of the available space in our size box. And we can rename this image to something like image underscore background. So now in our image, we can hit the drop down for brush. And for that, I can go into the UI material labs, go over to my materials folder, go to shapes, SDF effects, and we'll use this material instance right over here. Now, this isn't quite what I want right off the bat, because I don't necessarily want this animation to be happening non-stop. So I'm going to do a little bit of modification to the material to make it a little bit more professional and sleek for my purposes. So opening up the material itself, the first thing that I'm going to do is simply disable the animation. And if I hit save, we can see automatically that our animation has now stopped. And then what I can do is go into my material instance itself, and we can mess around with this a little bit. So the first thing I want to do is set my size to something like 1 and set the corner roundness to a value of 1 as well. So we have a perfect circle. And then for our stroke thickness, we can set this to a value of 0.1 and set our stroke color to be something like, yeah, nice blue makes sense. And I want to actually create an effect where when I hover over it, the blue outline becomes visible. So we'll take the stroke opacity from a value of 0 to 1. And the way that I'll handle that is by going back into my materials, and I'll create a lerp. And we're going to add a scalar parameter, call this isHovered. And then I'll make a little bit of space in my blend colors right here. And then I'll feed my stroke color into the B value. And then for the A value, I'll feed in the shape color. And that can go right and replace B. So basically, if it is hovered, it'll show the stroke color. And if we move the value to 0, if it's not hovered, it'll go back to only showing the shape color. Now, the way that we'll actually trigger this is by using an animation. And that's really where widget components come in really handy, because these are reusable animations that we can use for a bunch of different purposes throughout our project on a bunch of different widgets, as long as they're based off of this component. So I'm going to create a new animation, call it hover, selecting my hover animation, click my background image, open the animations back up. Let's dock this in the layout as well to make it a little easier. I will add image background to my scene. And by default, heading back into my material instance, I'll set the isHovered value to 0, since we don't want it to show the outline by default. And what I can now do is, in my animation timeline, I can select my image background, hit the plus icon, select brush and brush material. And what that'll do is it'll grab this SDF effects material, press plus, and I can now select my isHovered parameter. So a material parameter that I can now mess around with in animations in Widget. And then I want to quickly drag this timeline down to go with 20 seconds. So, or sorry, 20 milliseconds. After 20 milliseconds has passed, it should animate to a value of 1. So now if we press play, we can see that it does a nice little opacity animation. Now to actually trigger this animation, we'll want to use a button component. So grab a button, and like before, we'll set our horizontal and vertical alignments to be over everything. And I'm going to set the background color alpha to be 0. Since I don't want the button to be visible, I'm purely only going to be using it for its events. So we'll make this a variable. I'm going to call this button. And for onHovered, when we click that, it opens up a blueprint graph within our widget. So we can now add scriptable logic to it. And if I left click my button, which is now available in the variables, I can add my unhovered event as well. So now what I can do is I can grab my hover animation, drag it out, get hover, play animation forward, set hover to be the animation, and then on unhovered, play animation reverse, and drag and drop this for in animation. Now what I can do is I can go back to my toolbar menu, create a horizontal box, and then I'll add my widget component underscore button to it. And let's add 2, so 1 to trigger third person, 1 to trigger first person, and let's name them accordingly as well. Now for our horizontal box, if I select that, we can see that now I have these options on the left hand side to set the anchor. And we can see currently our anchor is at the top left of our screen, this being our widget screen. I'm going to set my anchor to be somewhere bottom center, and we can reset the X and the Y position so that it's nicely centered. Now for size X and size Y, I know that my widget component button is 60 by 60. So what I'll do is I will create for size X, I have 2 buttons, so 120, and size Y, 60. Now we have our perfect circles. And maybe I'll do a little bit of space in between these buttons. So I'll make that 130 for size X. And then in my palette, I'm going to search up for a spacer, drag and drop that in between my 2 buttons, and set the X value in our size to 10. Now we still need to fix an issue. Our widgets are currently spawning outside of our screen space. So what I'll do is in alignment, for the Y value, I'll change that to 1, so that it appears on the other side of the anchor in our screen space. And for alignment, I want it to be centered on our anchor, so I'll set it to 0.5. And for position Y, I want this to be a little bit higher off the screen space so it's not touching. So maybe I'll give it a padding of 25. So position Y, -25. Okay. Now, if I press play, you can see that we have 2 buttons that each have their own hover and unhover effects. Cool. Now we need to add the icons to these buttons. So let's do that. So I'm basically just going to copy and paste this image background, and I'm going to call this image icon, and we'll set this to be a variable as well. And for the image itself, we'll want it to be either the first person icon, or we'll want it to be the home icon. Now, because we're using this as a widget component, meaning that we can't actually set our image specifically within our widget component. Instead, what we can do is we can set this up to be a parameter. So going into my graph, I want to be using event preconstruct, and this will just basically let me see any changes I make while I'm still in the editor, and I don't actually have to press play to register the changes. So in event preconstruct, I'm going to grab my image icon, set brush, and in brush, we're going to promote this to a variable and call this button underscore icon. And now if we compile and save, we can see that this allows us to set our button icon, allows us to set the tint, image size, a bunch of other variables. Now if I hit compile and save and I go back into my toolbar, I don't have those options. And actually, my image is now just a rectangular box. The one step I need to add is going back into my button icon. I need to make this instance editable in my details panel and then expose on spawn. And then what I like to do is I like to add it to a category and call this user space parameters. Now if I go back to my toolbar and I click one of these buttons, we can see that a new window pops up called user parameter, and my button icon is now available. In my image, I can go T_UI and set my left icon to be the home button, and we can set the tint to be black so that I can actually see it. And then I can do the same thing for my first person button. Great, now if I press play, we can see that we now have a home button and a first person button. But when I click them, nothing happens. So let's add that next. Again, the click events are something that's going to be unique per button. So it's something that we want to be exposed like we had these images exposed. Now the way that we can do that is by going back into our widget component for the button. I can select my button, scroll all the way down, hit on clicked. And then what I can do is I can create an event dispatcher. So this exposes the event to outside sources. So I can say on clicked. I will drag this out, call my event dispatcher, and say that when the button is on clicked, the actual blueprint logic can be set from an outside source, like my toolbar widget. So if I compile my toolbar widget and I click one of these buttons, I'll first have to make sure that these widget components are set to be variables. And then if I select one, scroll all the way down, we can see that on clicked is now an event that's exposed. So for now, I'll just go print string and I'll say set third person. And then for our first person in our variables panel, we can do the exact same, copy paste this print string, set first person. So now if I press play and I click one of these widgets, you can see set third person is printing and set first person is printing. So we're able to now basically offload a lot of the logic for the widget button to outside sources. That way this component can handle global parameters. So things like that outline icon that we set up. All right, that's a wrap for this episode. Next is the final part, and we're going to be building the first person logic. See you then.